weather, then we have to charge more for the commodities, we have to ration demand, we have to make sure we can get other alternatives in place if need be.
Right, and when you're talking specifically things like corn and soybean products that obviously have a direct impact when there's extreme weather around the world.
Correct, and it's a different situation in the last 2.5 years. We've had a number of minor issues, but demand has been consistently outstripping supply. So it didn't take as much of a weather threat or as much of a supply threat for prices to begin to escalate. Now this also comes on the back of a much higher cost of production.
What of those commodities, the agricultural commodities, have the biggest impact? Is it corn? Is it soybeans?
It's coming from the food groups. It's coming from the industrial commodities. So that just shows us it's not in one area. It's supply's tight everywhere, and the world is really now coming to grips with the fact they haven't put enough investment. It's not speculation, it's investment in order to try and get that food in place for the world.
And now our interview with the World Bank, a group which says more and more people are falling into extreme poverty because of rising food prices. Tom Ackerman sat down with the managing director, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and began by asking how severe the crisis is now compared to 2008.
We think at the World Bank, after looking at our research and gauging what is going on around the world, that the situation is pretty severe. In the last quarter, we've seen the prices of oils and fats go up by 22%, and of grain, according to our food price index, and grains by 22%. And in the last 6 months, certain countries have seen really large increases in food prices of grains. For example, Kyrgyzstan, wheat prices have gone up by 54%, Bangladesh 45%, Tajikistan 37%, and I could go on and on. So we think it's pretty severe because tens of millions of people are being hit and thrown into extreme poverty, and these were the same people who suffered before in the 2008 crisis. However, this crisis differs from 2008 in a couple of ways. The first is that this is much more weather-related than we had in 2008. But the second, the somewhat good news about it is that it seems that global food stocks are somewhat better, and we've not had as many export restrictions thrown in, so that trade in food is moving much better than before.
Can we say that this is a function of less supply, more demand, or is it a mixture of both?
I think both. I think both supply and demand are critical factors. On the supply side, you've got a lot of uncertain weather events that have happened that have curtailed supply. Australia is a big grain producer, and they've had both drought and floods. China, we are watching to see what will happen with the weather events there, and so on. So yes, there's been an issue. But on the demand side, there are also issues because a steadily growing long-term trend is increased demand for food by a much larger population than before, and also by income. There are some income effects because in several emerging market countries, people are wealthier than before, and they're demanding higher priced meats and fats and oils, and you need more grains to feed into some of this. So this is also causing, prices to go up.
Is this uniformly the case with all food commodities, or are there some grains, for example, that where the situation is more stable and more reasonable?
Well, that's an interesting question, because in the 2008 crisis, the biggest impact was on grains. Grain prices shot up. This crisis, we're seeing, yes, grain prices going up, but also the price of other foodstuffs. So across a range of agricultural commodities, we're having this price effect.
You talked about the weather, but weather is cyclical, although people say that this may be a function of a long-term global warming situation.
The effect of drought and flood seems to be, happening in an unprecedented and rather unpredictable manner.
Some people inevitably point to speculation, or if you like, hoarding, or export curbs by countries such as Russia restricting the export of its own wheat in the past. To what extent does that aggravate this current situation?
Well, I think that, there's so many factors that play into this food price volatility, and no doubt there's a lot of liquidity in the international economy that is searching for investment. But I have to say that, look, we should focus on the issue of transparency as far as this is concerned, transparency of information, transparency of food stocks, because people often say, so what do you do? The point is that we don't always know exactly, how much food stocks are available worldwide, because, we don't have that information transparently. So it may be that in one country there's more than enough. And if we knew that, that would definitely have an impact on the movements of price in the market. So we need to get that information out, especially for the large producers.
What are the realistic prospects of some kind of humanitarian food reserves in situations like this?
Well, certainly, Bob Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, has proposed that we not only look at this transparency as a plank, but also think in terms of perhaps some humanitarian reserve. Certainly, when this type of situation happens, our concern at the World Bank is how to protect the most vulnerable in society, the poorer people, children, pregnant mothers. How do you get food to them in times of need? Because they're the most hit. And therefore, if we had at least some planning for some humanitarian reserves that could be used during the times of crisis, that would make a great deal of sense.
We've heard countries, particularly big exporting countries that you might call developing countries, Brazil, for example, which is a major food exporter, saying we should not panic on this, and we certainly shouldn't try to control prices, because this eventually will settle itself out and time will basically cure the situation.
Well, I certainly would not advocate panic, because panic doesn't lead to productive energies. We certainly would advocate great attention to solve the problem. Like I said, first thing is let's know what there is out there in terms of transparency of food stocks. Second, let us make sure that no export restrictions are not thrown in, so that food, particularly grains, are traded. Third, let's try to support the poor and vulnerable by putting in place safety nets. And we are working very actively on that in the World Bank with the poorer countries. And then fourth, support farmers, to produce small farmers with seeds and fertilizer. We did this in 2008. It worked. We were able to support 40 million people with our interventions of 1.5 billion that we put forward in the short term. Let's keep that as an instrument. 40% of harvests are sometimes lost in countries because of poor storage. Now, if we could help solve that problem, then we wouldn't be worrying so much about loss of food.
Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, thank you very much for speaking with Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
And from the necessities of life to things which most definitely aren't, but are often viewed as such. The lucrative market for technology, particularly things like smartphones, is one of the most fierce battles in the business world these days. And before you say, well, not everyone's got a mobile phone, consider that 90% of the planet now does have mobile phone coverage. As the world's population approaches 7 billion people, the number of mobile phone subscribers is likely to reach 5 billion soon, which is 70% of the planet. And much of that growth is coming from emerging markets. There are 500 million active users in China, while India adds 6 million subscribers.